Welcome back to the panel discussion, Targeting Advanced Threats, Proven Methods from Detection through Remediation, sponsored by FireEye on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Our panelists today are Bob Bigman, the former Chief Information Security Officer at the CIA, Lance Dubsky, the current Chief Information Security Officer at the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, Darren Van Booven, the Chief Information Security Officer and Assistant Chief Administrative Officer for the U.S. House of Representatives, Ben Rubin, the Director of Cyber and Information Security Operations at CGI, and Tony Cole, the Vice President and Global Government CTO at FireEye. I'm your moderator, Jason Miller. Before break, we got into a pretty good discussion about what an APT, Advanced Persistent Threats, threat intelligence, how does that play a role into detecting them, dealing with threats more generally. So let's talk about defense, because I think one of the key points around this conversation has to be, okay, so we know we have them, we know we get a lot of intelligence, we know the intelligence is overwhelming sometimes. What do you do with it? So how do you defend against APTs? Let me turn to Bob to start.
So what really seems to be working these days is, and no surprise, is really well-configured, well-managed systems. As I said, it's not the sexy part of information security, but for those institutions and organizations who, for example, in the Microsoft world, really actually set their group policy and security settings on their system right, and those basically monitor their very critical files. So no matter how sophisticated the attack is, certain changes have to occur on your computer network. There's just no way around that. Those organizations who have figured that out and have done smart applications of monitoring those specific files are seeing the advanced APT. Those organizations, strangely enough, don't seem to get hit again.
Let me turn to Ben on this one, since you run networks for other companies, other agencies. How hard is it to get to that place that Bob talked about? I mean, Bob's discussing Nirvana, and we all know that we're not sure Nirvana exists.
It can be difficult, but having the right team and having the right focus, knowing where your destination is going to be the quickest way to get there, obviously. I see a lot of companies and organizations that get lost along the way. They start focusing on the compliances that they have to meet, which are important, of course, but aren't designed to allow you to respond and detect these types of threats.
Let me turn to Lance for a sec. You guys, in many regards, are considered, from an intelligence community standpoint, ahead of most people when it comes to detecting, dealing with threats. There's a big push across government now for continuous monitoring, as an example. When you guys defend against APTs, and I don't want to get into the classified area here at all, but give me a sense of what types of things you're doing. How do you make that balance?
So I think it's a combination of a few things. What Bob said is exactly right. A back-to-basics approach on security engineering. When you're building a system, building in the security controls and testing those controls very thoroughly. If you deliver a system that's secure, that's not the end state. That's actually the beginning, because from a services perspective, you have to start doing continuous monitoring. You have to make sure, as Bob said, the configuration management and the control of those activities are in place. At NGA, we stood up a cybersecurity operations cell to combine all of the different cyber functions into one area so that we can focus on people, process, technology, the ingest of threat intelligence, how to use it. But when you look at threat intelligence, if you can evaluate, go down to that core bit of information that you really need. If you understand how your networks are instrumented so that you can collect that information thoroughly, analyze it quickly, you're ahead of the game, and that's where we're working for. That's what we're working for.
I want to turn to Tony, but let me just one quick follow-up. When you talk about analyze it quickly, seconds, days, weeks, I know it all depends because of what you're ingesting.
So I'm saying minutes to a few hours, because if you're really linked in with your partner agencies and industry, when information becomes available, you should be able to look at that, understand the source, its relevance, and quickly understand how am I exposed to that particular threat and whether I need to react on it quickly or whether it's something that's in areas that could be handled at a later time or even not at all.
A little bit of classic risk management. Tony?
I wanted to actually make a comment following up on what Lance said. The fastest we've seen data exfiltrated out of a network after a compromise is 7 minutes. Definitely not the average, much longer than that, but it is, very, very important to react very quickly. And I wanted to make another point that, I think it's critical for us to point out that meeting your compliance requirements, does not mitigate your risk. Meeting your risk mitigation requirements as the CISO or CIO of an organization, or even a user for that matter, or anybody in an organization, and working towards compliance is a much better fashion, to actually look at the problem from. So because that can help you. But you also need to stay aware of, what some of the changing recommendations are across the board. NIST recently updated 800-53 last year, so added in, detonation chambers in revision 4 for Security Control 44 to talk about some of these new attacks and how you can mitigate APTs. So it's important to see some of the changing policies that are coming down as well, to help you meet that risk mitigation problem that you need to take care of.
Let me turn to Darren, because on one hand, you have a different set of challenges than maybe some of the other people at the table, because you can't be seen as the CISO of no, right? The CIO no. I know you're not officially the CIO, but how do you kind of make that balance of defending against something like an APT and still ensuring there's access and connectivity and all those good things that your 435 customers need?
Well, I think the first thing is you definitely need to have a strategy. You need to have a game plan as far as how you're going to attack the problem. And in terms of having a good defense, really an organization, and this is how I view my own organization, is that you're only as strong as your weakest link. And generally there are two weakest links that I tend to focus on. One is what I call configuration creep, and what I mean by that is once you've attained this nirvana state, that's great, but it's only great if you can maintain it. And so an organization's IT environment and security controls environment is similar to a living organism. It changes. And so you have to have a strategy for keeping on top of making sure that the environment stays the way you want it, to make sure that the controls are implemented, to make sure they're working effectively, and to make sure that they stay that way. And secondly, we certainly cannot overlook the importance of the end user. We talked earlier about the fact that phishing attacks still occur because they're effective. And so all it takes is one user clicking on one link in a bad email to possibly circumvent all of the controls that you've worked so hard to implement. So you have to constantly educate users on what the threats are, and try to the degree you can imbue a sense of what the right behavior is that they should be following, and repeat to keep doing that to try to minimize that threat.
And I think configuration creep is a great word, because in many sense, what the White House has done over the last, I would say, decade is really tried to address that idea of configuration creep. Are we still seeing it? Is that still a problem, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're trying to find the answer. We're trying to solve this problem, trying to find what works next. And every new opportunity introduced from the vendor community or that you hear discussed in public is certainly worth trying. Again, I think it's wonderful. I also have issues with configuration creep, but these are smart people. These hackers. Let me tell you something. They're very, very good. Our approach to defending them has to be applying our intelligence as well. I don't mean our intelligence as an organization. I mean our individual intelligence. And we can't keep relying on industry to solve this problem. There's ways and things we need to do to better defend our networks, which every study after every study shows that the U.S. government is simply not doing. Play defense really well. There's a term I see now in the private space called ruthless configuration management. I couldn't agree better. And then you're going to find you're raising the bar dramatically on the opposition.
Lance.
I think one of the challenges maybe for some government agencies are that sometimes IT is acquired, built, designed in a variety of different locations within the organization. So within the last few months, NGA, our CIO, issued a policy combining all of the IT in the organization into one organization, moving all of the system administrators into one organization, so that you have one agile acquisition process, but which you have oversight of the entire design, build, test, and operate. So that's one way that we're trying to buy down the risk, as well as increase efficiency in how we're going to meet our future state vision.
And what's interesting is, in many ways, we're seeing some movement on Capitol Hill around the Federal Information Acquisition Reform Act, FITARA, that's giving CIOs exactly what you just said in terms of one belly button to push. I think as my colleague Tom Temin likes to call it. Bob, you're shaking your head. You obviously think that's a great idea.
Absolutely. I can't imagine why we ever did it not like that. I mean, it's like having multiple agencies inside your own agency. Why would you ever allow that? It's inefficient. It breeds insecurity, and it's just the wrong way. I mean, it's everything the Harvard Business School tells you not to do. So, yeah, I'm all in support of it.
Very interesting. Let me move over to the idea of the federal tool set, and maybe are there areas that maybe would be nice to have, would be nice to in terms of what's missing around the APT and threat intelligence. Let me turn to Tony first, since you guys are kind of in that market of trying to help agencies. Are you hearing anything from your customers of what they're asking for?
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? In the CDM contract that recently rolled out, I think is a great start. Part of the challenge, though, is getting a lot of the procurement officials up to speed on some of the attacks taking place and understanding, what the adversaries are doing, so they can actually focus in the right areas. I think, as the panel has pointed out, configuration management is absolutely critical, to stemming the flow of these attacks and making at least your attack surface much, much smaller. So if you're going to do that, you still need to defend, where there's potentially chinks in the armor. So you've got to actually have the ability to do procurements in that area. So we need procurement officials to actually understand this changing threat landscape, because it's only going to get, more sophisticated down the line. And that's an area today that a lot of them don't understand, because they do the comparison between old tools and new tools. Oh, well, this detects a lot more attacks. No, not really. Those are mostly false positives. So that's a challenge that we see today, is just getting the procurement side up to speed.
It's interesting you bring up the continuous diagnostics and mitigation, the CDM contract. That's being hailed in many ways as trying to standardize the tools that are coming in, but it's also creating this idea of more data, the dashboard and sensors. Let me turn to Darren real quick. I know you guys don't fall under the DHS rubric of CDM, but are you guys looking at continuous monitoring and then sensors and dashboards, and how do you make heads and tails of all this data as well?
Absolutely. I think you have to, as a defender. If you're not investigating continuous monitoring these days, or having that as part of your strategic security strategy, I think you're really missing the boat. And part of the reason for that is, I mentioned earlier, this is really an arms race, and the adversary acts very quickly. And so you need to be able to have a real-time assessment of your security posture at all times if you're going to understand where those weak points in your armor are, because that's where they go. An attacker these days, they're not going to hit your firewall directly. They may send you a phishing email. They may attack your applications, which essentially punch a hole right through your firewalls. They're going to use the method that works. And so you need to make sure to understand, where are all of the access points into your network? How would the attacker actually attack you? And you have to spend a lot of time thinking about that and evaluating the technologies that are out there in the marketplace to help you defend. And so one of the things I do, I spend a lot of time with vendors, talking with them about what solutions they have, what they're working on to address the gaps of the future, so that I can plan for not only what the gaps are today, but to plan for the future as well.
And Ben?
I think Darren made an important distinction in the transition between relying on security technologies to really understanding your internal network and what you have at play. The CDM makes an important distinction in the foundation of cybersecurity in visibility and being able to see what's taking place on your network. When you're facing and defending against these threats, these attackers are using what you have in place. There's no way around that. They have to use your infrastructure to get at what their objective is. And a lot of the times that's going to be the sensitive information. So if you know where that information is on your network and you know how an attacker is going to even need to get there, you can shift your paradigm a little bit from technologies to visibility. And I think that's where the CDM is making the first strike.
All right, Tony, we're going to 2-for-1 you here. I know you have something to say to follow on, but we're also going to ask you, what's the takeaway from all this with APTs and threat intelligence? So two comments there.
I'll loop it into one. So I think one of the things that we need to take away is agility. So if you look, in the last 10 years, how quickly our military has adapted to the changes in warfare. So we now have a new domain that wars are being fought in. And whether you agree with cyber war or not, we certainly can agree that espionage has moved into the online domain now. And that's a big, big change for us, because you see the military adapt quickly, and yet in the cyber domain now, there is no end where this is the DoD network. Instead, it's everybody is being attacked in the U.S. government on a continuous basis. So we need to think in that perspective, and it's something that a lot of people haven't accepted today when you look at the nation-state attacks. So we need to be agile in our procurements and how we actually defend our networks, because the adversary is going to continue to shift tactics down the line.
All right, let me turn to Lance and talk just as a kind of a wrap-up from an NGA perspective. What should people take away? What's your takeaway message around threat intelligence and APT?
I think whittling it down to the very useful piece in a quick nature and a quick perspective. I completely agree with Ben on how you're using that information, understanding where your critical data is, and being able to protect that, like we've talked about. And where I'm pushing is a back-to-basics approach on designing the system securely, testing them, and then holding program managers accountable for making sure that those systems remain secure. And I'm going to watch that through the implementation of enterprise security as a service and continuous monitoring.
All right. Bob Bigman, you get the last word.
Yeah, again, I think the takeaway here is I think we have to fundamentally rethink securing networks and systems. For many years, we've been running after the next great tool, the next great product, the next great thinking. I think it's time to look inwards and say the thinking is really what we have to do to really better manage our networks. I mean, I think we can actually, through sound configuration, sound network architecture, reduce our exposure to at least 95% of the threats that we're exposed to. So more emphasis on looking inwards, coming up with, as I love that word, ruthless configuration management, securing our internal systems and networks optimally, working on that as opposed to working on the next policy that we have to write and the next product we have to buy.
All right, on that note, unfortunately, we are out of time for today. You've been listening to the panel discussion, Targeting Advanced Threats, Proven Methods from Detection Through Remediation, sponsored by FireEye, on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. I'd like to thank our guests today, Bob Bigman, the former Chief Information Security Officer at the CIA, Lance Dubsky, the current Chief Information Security Officer at the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, Darren Van Booven, the Chief Information Security Officer and Assistant Chief Administrative Officer for the U.S. House of Representatives, Ben Rubin, the Director of Cyber and Information Security Operations at CGI, and Tony Cole, Vice President and Global Government CTO at FireEye. I'm your moderator, Jason Miller. If you missed any part of this program or would like to learn more about threat intelligence, please visit federalnewsradio.com/FireEye.
On behalf of FireEye and Federal News Radio, thanks to the panel for this informative discussion. You'll be presented with some polling questions as you leave the webinar to help us improve future sessions. We appreciate your feedback. We'll have the archive from this session available shortly, and a link will be sent to you for you to share with your colleagues. Those of you who requested a training certificate for this webinar should receive it in the next 2 weeks. Be sure to register for upcoming webinars from the Capital Exchange. This concludes today's webinar, and thank you.